and welcome to Fireside Fairytales. If you've never been here before, my name is Rory, and you're watching Varietal Literature's YouTube page. It's a cozy little corner of the internet for narrative. Sorry, my headphones are being a little fussy. There we go. Hopefully the sound's okay out there. It was a little muffled for me. Nonetheless, what we're going to do tonight is we're going to read old folklore and fairy tales, a little bit of sound effects, some fun voices, things like that. In particular, we're reading from the Scottish Fairy Book, so there are going to be 2 Scottish tales. If you are here live, there is a live chat, and you should join it because there's a little crop of potatoes already growing there. I see Tammy Morelli is back from her concert with her son. I'm glad you had fun. Thank you for the compliments on the Thursday stream. Jumpstore, hello, good to see you. I hope your migraines stay well away. Zombie Wolf, good to see you. I hope your birthday was fun. And good evening to you, GS. And I'm sure some more will filter in. If you're not watching live, though, what you can do is go down to the description below, and there will be timestamps that allow you to jump ahead to whatever interests you the most. In this case, we'll be reading 2 stories. The first one is called Canonbie Dick and the Thomas of Ercildoune, Ercildoune, or Ercildoune. I don't know. It's very hard to find pronunciation guides for old Gaelic words like this. I'm assuming it's Gaelic anyways. I can't imagine it would be anything else. And it's particularly hard because this particular word is a city or a town in Australia, which I don't think is going to be pronouncing it the same way. That is the first story. The second story we're going to be reading is called The Laird O'Co, which that name will be explained in the beginning of the story. They're both shorter stories, and they're both Scottish. And I'll talk a little bit about that. I'm not going to say too much about these stories. They don't really have much in common with each other, unlike most of our streams. But that's okay. Catherine Leslie Fay. Hi. Hello, Catherine. Lovely to see you. Let me say a little bit on the stories, and then I will get into telling them. So tonight, these are 2 Scottish stories. They have little in common, save that they are Scottish, and I like them. And I'm also Scottish. Well, by descent. I'm Canadian. So I suppose that gives me some other connection. What I will say is that the first tale has an echo to some of our tales we had out of Brittany last week, where we see a bold man ignore advice, confusing it for courage, and getting himself into a spot of trouble. Oh, Lizzie Rose is here. Hello, Lizzie. Good to see you. Anyhow, that is a bit of a connection we see. I will mention that as a reminder, we were reading Brittany folklore last week. Brittany is a region in north western France, and traditionally was descended from a group of people called Bretons, who also were in southern England, and I believe were a part of the Celtic tribes. Somebody tell me if I'm wrong on that, but that is my understanding. Which is appropriate here because we are also talking about Scottish folklore now. There's some other connections there. The second story is just a classic sort of folklore formulation. I don't think at any point you won't know where it's going. It's interesting. It has a bit of magic. I just liked it. And it didn't really fit too many other places, and I was a little shy on content for the one story today, so I decided to fit it in here. Tammy says, I just refer to my heritage to being a mutt. Too many to name. I mean, that's very common for North America. North Americans at this point. Zombie Wolf says, and I thought alcohol was colloquially known as courage. We'll see an interesting application of alcohol in our second story. One I've not really heard before, but I gotta be honest, isn't that surprising? Okay. So going back to where I started though with the titles, I'm just gonna say this up front. I say this pretty often. I do my best to find guides on pronunciation and so on, I'm looking at a large group of family of languages when I read these stories, and sometimes the words, because this book, Scottish Fairy Book, was published like in the 1900s, 1800s, kind of at the turn of that century there. Some of these words just don't have much presence in language anymore, and it's really hard to find anyone saying them. So I have to take my best guess based on what I know about the language, and I think it's probably often wrong. So if you know the language, feel free to correct me in the chat, and I will try to adapt. But otherwise, if you're of these places, I apologize. So that's my way of saying, for example, the title here, I have no confidence on how to pronounce it. I think my neighbors are arguing. Let me check. They are arguing, as we saw last week as well. Well, I will do my best for that not to pick up. Because there's not much I can do but maybe throw some water on them. Anyways, this is my way of saying I can't pronounce a lot of these things here, and I couldn't really find much to guide me through their pronunciation, especially for Gaelic, Scottish Gaelic. So I apologize to everyone who knows what they're doing. Just as they were arguing last time. They argue often. Though this one sounds angry. Nope, they're not calming down. Okay, I thought we could listen to the piano for a minute. Okay. Nonetheless, let's get to the story. Now it is Scotland. Jumpstore says, "Oh, I love arguing neighbors. It's free reality trash TV from the comfort of your front lawn." I mean, that's true enough. I have some concerns about this neighbor, but I'm not going to get into that here. We can't hear them, Rory just says. It depends on how you're listening to them. If I can hear them in my headphones, that means people out there could hear them in their headphones. Anyhow. Let's hope they find a way to better communicate with each other. Our first story tonight comes to us from the Scottish Fairy Book, which is where both our stories are going to come from. And this one in particular is called Canonbie Dick and Thomas of Ercildoune. And that Thomas you probably know in another context by another name, but you will see in this story. If you want to read the Scottish Fairy Book yourself, it is available on Gutenberg, Project Gutenberg, for free.org. And because it's an older book. It chanced long years ago that a certain horse dealer lived in the south of Scotland, near the border, not very far from Longtown. He was known as Canonbie Dick. And as he went up and down the country, he almost always had a long string of horses behind him, which he bought at one fair and sold at another, generally managing to turn a good big penny by the transaction. He was a very fearless man, not easily daunted, and the people who knew him used to say that if Canonbie Dick dare not attempt a thing, no one else need be asked to do it. One evening, as he was returning from a fair at some distance from his home with a pair of horses, who you can hear coming in now, which he had not succeeded in selling, he was riding over the Bowden Moor, which lies to the east of Ercildoune Hills. In these hills, as all men know, the scene of some of the most famous of Thomas the Rhymer's prophecies. And also, so men say, they are the sleeping place of King Arthur and his knights, who rest under 3 high peaks, waiting for a mystic call that shall awaken them. But little recked the horse dealer of Arthur and his knight, nor yet of Thomas the Rhymer, who we've told stories of on this stream before. He was riding along at a snail's pace, thinking over the bargains which he'd made at the fair that day, and wondering when he was likely to dispose of his 2 remaining horses. And all at once, startled by the approach of a venerable man with white hair and an old dress, who seemed to almost start out of the ground, so suddenly did he make his appearance. And when they met, the stranger stopped, and to Canonbie Dick's great amazement, asked him how much he'd be willing to part with his horses. The wily horse dealer thought that he saw a chance of driving a good bargain, for the stranger looked a man of some consequence, and so he named him a good round sum, which is Scottish for he ripped him off. The old man tried to bargain with him, but when he found that he had not a chance of succeeding, for no one ever did succeed in inducing Canonbie Dick to sell a horse for less a sum than he named it at first, he agreed to buy the animals, and pulling a bag of gold from the pocket of his queerly cut breeches, he began to count out the price. And he did so. Canonbie Dick got another shock of surprise, for the gold that the stranger gave him was not the gold that he was in use at the time, but was fashioned into unicorns and bonnet pieces. I'm going to pause for a minute. I think most people know this, but should you not? The official Scottish animal, national creature, is a unicorn. That's why it's on their money, or their old money anyways, and other ancient coins, which would be of no use to the horse dealer in his everyday transaction, but it was good pure gold, and he took it gladly, for he knew that he was selling his horses at about half as much a gain as they were worth. So he thought to himself, surely I cannot be a loser in the long run. Then the 2 parted, but not before the old man had commissioned Dick to get him other good horses at the same price. The only stipulation he made being that Dick should always bring them to the same spot after dark, and that he should always come alone. For whenever he came across a suitable horse, he had only lead it over Bowden Moor after dark. And he was sure to meet the mysterious white-headed stranger, who always paid him for the animal in old-fashioned, good, golden pieces. And he might have been selling horses to him yet, for aught I know, had it not been for this one failing. Canonbie Dick was apt to get very thirsty, and his ordinary customers, knowing this, took care to always to provide him with something to drink. But this old man never did so. He paid down his money and led away his horses, and there was an end of the matter. But one night, Dick, being even more thirsty than usual, and feeling sure that his mysterious friend must live somewhere in the neighborhood, seeing that he was always wandering about the hillside when everyone else was asleep, hinted that he would be very glad to go home with him and have a little refreshment. He would need to be a brave man who has to go with me, returned the stranger. But if thou wilt, thou canst follow me. Only remember this, if thy courage fail thee at that which thou wilt behold, thou wilt rue it all thy life. Canonbie Dick laughed long and loud. "My courage hath never failed me yet. Beshrew me if I will let it fail now. So lead on, old man, and I will follow," he cried. Without a word, the stranger turned and began to ascend a narrow path which led to a curious hillock, from which its shape was called by the country folk the Lucken Hare. It was supposed to be the great haunt of witches, and as a rule, nobody passed that way after dark if they could possibly help it. Canonbie Dick was not afraid of witches, however, and so he followed his guide with a bold step up the hillside, but it must be confessed that he felt a little startled when he saw him turn down what seemed to be an entrance to a cavern, especially as he never remembered having seen any opening in the hillside there before. He paused for a moment, looking around him in perplexity and wondering where he was being taken, and his conductor glanced at him scornfully. "You can go back if you will," he said. "I warned thee thou wert going on a journey that would try thy courage to the uttermost." There was a jeering note in his voice, maybe only in his perception, but nonetheless, as far as Canonbie Dick was concerned, it was there, and it touched on Dick's pride. And if you know the Scottish, that is our gold. Who said I was afraid? He retorted. "I was just taking note of where this passage stands on the hillside, so as to know it another time." The stranger shrugged his shoulders. "Time enough to look for it when thou wouldst visit it again," he said, and then he pursued his way, with Dick following closely at his heel. After the first yard or two, they were enveloped in a thick darkness, and the horse dealer would have been sore, but put to it to keep near his guide had not the latter held out his hand for him to grasp. But after a little space, a faint glimmering of light began to appear, which grew clearer and clearer until at last they found themselves in an enormous cavern lit by flaming torches, which were stuck here and there in sconces in the rocky walls, and which, although they served to give light enough to see by, yet threw such ghostly shadows on the floor that they only seemed to intensify the gloom that hung over this vast apartment. And the curious thing about this mysterious cave was that along one side of it ran a long row of horse stalls, just like what one would find in a stable. And in each stall stood a coal-black charger, saddled and bridled as if ready for the fray. And on the straw, by every horse's side, lay the gallant figure of a knight, clad from head to foot in coal-black armor, with a drawn sword in their mailed hand. But not a horse moved, not a chain rattled. The knights and steeds alike were silent and motionless, looking exactly as if some strange enchantment had been thrown over them, and they'd been suddenly turned into this black marble. There was something so awesome in the still, cold figures and in the unearthly silence that brooded over everything that Canonbie Dick, reckless and daring though he was, felt his courage waning and his knees began to shake under him. In spite of these feelings, however, he followed the old man up the hall to the far end of it, where there was a table of ancient workmanship, on which was placed a glittering sword and a curiously wrought hunting horn. And when they reached this table, the stranger turned to him and said with great dignity, "Thou hast heard, good man, of Thomas of Ercildoune, Thomas the Rhymer, as men call him. He who went to dwell for a time with the Queen of Fairyland, and from her received the gifts of truth and prophecy." Canonbie Dick nodded, for as the wonderful soothsayer's name fell on his ears, his heart sank within him and his tongue seemed to cleave to the roof of his mouth. If he'd been brought here to parley with Thomas the Rhymer, then he'd laid himself open to all the eldritch powers of darkness. "I that speak to thee am he," went on the white-haired stranger, "and I have permitted thee thus to have thy desire, and follow me hither in order that I may try of what stuff thou art made. Before thee lies a horn and a sword. He that will sound one or draw the other shall, if his courage fail not, be king over the whole of Britain. I, Thomas the Rhymer, has spoken it. And as thou knowest, my tongue cannot lie. But list ye, the outcome of it all depends on thy bravery, and it will be a light task or a heavy, according as thou layest hand on sword or horn first." Now, Dick was more versed in giving blows than in making music, and his first impulse was to seize the sword. Then, come what might, he had something in his hand to defend himself with. But just as he was about to lift it, the thought struck him. If the place were full of spirits, as he felt sure it must be, this action of him might be taken to mean defiance, might cause them to band themselves together against him. And there's the icon photo in its black and white form. So changing his mind, he picked up the horn with a trembling hand and blew a blast upon it. Which, however, was so weak and feeble that it could scarce be heard at the other end of the hall. The result that followed was enough to appall the stoutest heart. Thunder rolled in. In crashing peals through the immense hall. The charmed knights and their horses awoke in an instant from their charmed sleeps. The knights sprang to their feet and seized their swords, brandishing them around their heads while their great black chargers stamped and snorted and ground their bits as if eager to escape from their stalls. And where a moment before all had been stillness and silence, there was now a scene of wild din and excitement. Now was the time for Canonbie Dick to play the man. If he'd done so, all the rest of his life might have been different. But his courage failed him, and he lost his chance. Terrified at seeing so many threatening faces turned towards him, he dropped the horn and made one weak, undecided effort to pick up the sword. But ere he could do so, a mysterious voice sounded from somewhere in the hall, and these were the words that it uttered. "Woe to the coward that ever he was born, who did not draw the sword before he blew the horn." And before Dick knew what he was about, a perfect whirlwind of raw air tore through the cavern, carrying the luckless horse dealer along with it, and hurrying him along the narrow passage through which he had entered, dashed him down outside on a bank of loose stones and shale, and he fell right on down to the bottom, where he was found with little life left in him next morning by some shepherds, to whom he'd just strength enough left to whisper the story of his weird and fearful adventure. And there is his body strewn at the base of the hill. This one's a little harder to navigate. Oh, it didn't grow when I moved it down. Oh well. But yes, there you go. There's the end of old Canonbie. Now, I was interested, before I move on to the last story of the evening, I was interested in, like, what is it about him picking up the horn first that was the wrong move? And I don't really know, but I will say that horns were usually used as like an intimidation tactic, right? Now it says it's a hunting horn, so who knows? But in traditionally, especially in Scottish armies and so on, what would be happening is you would blow the horn to intimidate your foes down the hill that you're about to fight. So I wonder if the point here is that, like, by choosing the horn first, he showed that he was all bluster and not action. That's my best guess. Jumpstore says, found with little life left in him. Just sounds like Bra finished his shift at work. Indeed. I guess he did, because he sells horses, and this was a hell of a day. Lizzie Rose says, I'm switching to whiskey. Just as I can't find his face. It took me a while to find his face, too. If you follow the bent arm, this way? Yeah. It's sort of faded, but his head is there. He's hanging onto a cap, and his tartan is sort of wrapped around him. Okay. So that's the story of Canonbie Dick and Thomas of Ercildoune. It's been a while since we read it, but we did read the Thomas the Rhymer stories, or the ones that I've found so far. I could not tell you what they were called, but we have read them. What I called the stream is what I mean. So you'll just have to watch every single episode I've ever made. Gennaro says he held on just long enough to tell the tale. It's a classic formulation. Also, hello, Gennaro. Good to see you. It's a classic formulation, right? You know, to deal with somebody in the crowd going, if this really happened and he died, how do you know? right? So you add that on if you're a bard. Okay. This is a simpler tale. It comes in... it sort of serves as a fusion of a few different tales I've read in the past, as many folklore pieces do. Like a lot of Scottish folklore, it makes reference to real events, which I've always found interesting. Like, it's not the only tradition that does that, but it's not as common, I will say. Like, it's more likely if you're going to read, for example, Yeats's collection of Irish folklore and fairy tales. It's more often just, you know, there was some guy named Joe who was a farmer, not Joe, you know, Paddy or whatever, who was named a farmer, or who was a farmer, and then he saw some spirits, and this is the adventure he went on, and so on. But a lot of Scottish folklore is a lot more interested in, like, giving an explanation, a fantastical explanation for real events in history. That's a good point, Jumpstore. It's not even just the half hour, right? Because he, like, got blown out there in the middle of the night, and then he wakes up. I am curious what your guys' theory is as to why taking the horn first was wrong, keeping in mind that the deal was these were likely King Arthur's knights. The story seems to imply that, though it doesn't necessarily draw a direct line. And that picking correctly and keeping courage in your heart was more likely to would be allow you to be the king of Britain. So it's a test for kingdom, probably better than ladies handing out swords from swamps, but of a similar tradition. So what is it? But he does say that depending on which one you pick first, you will have a harder time or an easier time. And then in the end, it's sort of revealed that picking the horn wasn't the good idea. My theory is that it's like real courage is sort of silent and stern, and fake courage is when you're a blowhard, you know. You make a big announcement and whatever else, that he did it out of cowardice. Keeping in mind, by the way, before I carry on with the story, keep in mind that depending on where this story finds its roots, how far back into Scottish history it goes. If you're going back 1,000 years in Scottish history, it's more akin to, like, biker gangs than it is any conception we have of a kingdom. You know, like, someone will be your ruler, your chief, because he beat up his brother in a church with a group of his friends, beat his brother to death and took the role, right? Like, that's the kind of stories you get if you go far enough back into Scottish history. It's pretty rough and tumble. So as far as if you're trying to test for a kingdom under the ethos of that, maybe picking up the sword is better, because the way you defend the throne is by being the toughest in the land. That's an interesting point, Gennaro. I like that. Zombie Wolf says he chose poorly. Anyone get that reference? I think most people in this chat are old enough to get that reference. I would hope, anyways. Yeah, Gennaro says maybe it's like he had to confess his sins first, like he had a lot of shame. I do remember what it is, Zombie Wolf, and I do remember which one it is. I'm just not going to... Yeah, I'm not going to be able to... Yeah, anyways. Let's go for the second story. I don't know what my TV is doing. Give me a second. Sorry about this. There we go. All right. It's enough babbling from me. Our final story of the evening is called The Laird comes to us from the Scottish Fairy Book, and it proceeds as thus. It was a fine summer morning, and the Laird was having a dander on the green turf outside the castle walls. His real name was Laird O'Cozon. Again, not sure on the pronunciation. And his descendants today bear the proud title of Marquis of Ailsa. But all up and down Ayrshire, nobody called him anything but Laird because of coves or caves, which were to be found in the rock on which his castle was built. He was a kind man and a courteous, always ready to be interested in the affairs of his poorer neighbors, and willing to listen to any tale of woe. So when a little boy came across the green, carrying a small can in his hand and pulling his forelock, asked him if he might go to the castle and get a little ale for his sick mother, the Laird gave his consent at once, and patting the little fellow on the head, told him to go to the kitchen and ask for the butler, and tell him that he, the Laird, had given orders that his can was to be filled with the best ale that was in the cellar. Away the boy went, and found the old butler, who, after listening to his message, took him down into the cellar and proceeded to carry out his master's orders. There was one cask of particularly fine ale, which was kept entirely for the Laird's own use, which had been opened for some time before, and was now about half full. "I will fill the Baron's can out of this," thought the old man to himself. "'Tis both nourishing and light, the very thing for sick folk." So taking the can from the child's hand, he proceeded to draw the ale. But what was his astonishment to find that although the ale flowed freely enough from the barrel, the little can, which could not have held more than a quarter of a gallon, remained always just half full. The ale poured into it in a clear amber stream until the big cask was quite empty, and still the quantity that was in the little can did not seem to increase. The butler could not understand it. He looked at the cask, and then he looked at the can. Then he looked down at the floor at his feet to see if he had not spilt any. No, the ale had not disappeared in that way, for the cellar floor was as white and dry and clean as possible. "Plague on the can, must be bewitched," thought the old man, and his short, stubby hair stood up like porcupine quills round his bald head, for as if there was anything on earth of which he had a mortal dread, it was warlocks and witches and such like bogles. "I'm not going to broach another barrel," he said gruffly, handing back the half-filled can to the little lad. "So you may just go home with what is there. The Laird's ale is too good to waste on a smatchet like thee." But the boy stoutly held his ground. A promise was a promise, and the Laird had both promised and sent orders to the butler that the can was to be filled, and he would not go home till it was filled. It was in vain that the old man first argued and then grew angry. The boy would not stir a step. The Laird had said that he was to get the ale, and the ale must be halved. At last the perturbed butler left him standing there and hurried off to his master to tell him he was convinced that the can was bewitched, for if it had swallowed up a whole half cask of ale, and after doing so it was only half full, and to ask if he would come down himself and order the lad off the premises. "Not I," said the genial Laird, "for the little fellow is quite right. I promised that he should have his can full of ale to take home to his sick mother, and he shall have it if it takes all the barrels in my cellar to fill it. So haste thee to the house again and open another cask." The butler dared not disobey, but he reluctantly retraced his steps. But as he went, he shook his head sadly, for it seemed to him that not only the boy with the can, but his master also was bewitched. When he reached the cellar, he found the bairn waiting patient. I usually mention this, so I haven't mentioned it here, but just a reminder, bairn is a Scottish word for child. Where he'd left him, and without wasting further words, he took the can from his hand and broached another barrel. If he'd been astonished before, he was more astonished now. Scarce had a couple of drops fallen from the tap, than the can was full to the brim. "Take it, laddie, and be gone, with all the speed thou canst," he said, glad to get the can out of his fingers. And the boy did not wait for a second bidding. Thanking the butler most earnestly for his trouble and paying no attention to the fact that the old man had not been so civil to him as he might have been, he departed. Nor, though the butler took pains to ask all round the countryside, could he ever hear of him again, nor of anyone who knew anything about him or anything about his sick mother. Years passed by, and sore trouble fell upon the house of Co. For the Laird went to fight in the wars in Flanders, and chancing to be taken prisoner, he was shut up in prison and condemned to death. Alone in a foreign country, he had no friends to speak for him, and escape seemed hopeless. It was the night before his execution, and he was sitting in his lonely cell thinking sadly of his wife and children, whom he never expected to see again. At the thought of them, the picture of his home rose clearly in his mind, the grand old castle standing on its rock, and the bonny daisy-spangled stretch of greensward which lay before its gates, where he'd been wont to take a dander in the sweet summer mornings. Then, all unbidden, a vision of the little lad carrying the can, who'd come to beg for ale for his sick mother, and whom he had long ago forgotten, rose up before him. And there's the little lad, coming into the cell to where he's sitting. The vision was so clear and distinct that he felt almost as if he were acting the scene over again, and he rubbed his eyes to get rid of it, feeling that if he had to die tomorrow, it was time that he turned his thoughts to better things. But as he did so, the door of his cell flew noiselessly open, and there on the threshold stood the self-same little lad, looking not a day older, with his finger on his lip, and a mysterious smile upon his face. "Laird o' Co, rise and go," he whispered, beckoning him to follow him. Needless to say, the Laird did so, too much amazed to think of asking questions. Though through the long passages of the prison the little lad went, the Laird close at his heels, and whenever he came to a locked door, he had but to touch it, and it opened before them, so that in no long time they were safe outside the walls. The overjoyed Laird would have overwhelmed his little deliverer with the words of thanks, had not the boy held up his hand to stop him. "Get on my back," he said shortly, "for thou art not safe till thou art out of this country." And the Laird did as he was bid, and marvellous as it seems, the boy was quite able to bear his weight, and as soon as he was comfortably seated, the pair set off over sea and land, and never stopped till in almost less time than it takes to tell it, the boy set him down, in the early dawn, on the daisy-spangled green in front of his castle, just where he'd spoken to him first so many years before. Then he turned and laid his little hand on the Laird's big one. "Aye, good turn deserves another. Take ye for being so kind to my old mother," he said, and vanished. And from that day to this, he has never been seen again. All right. Well, it's quite warm here, so I'm not going to tarry too long. Thank you very much, Genera, Tammy, GS, Jum Store, Zombie Wolf. I know Lizzie Rose dropped in, and we had Catherine come by. Thank you very much, all of you, for coming. to the stream tonight. And Tammy, what says great stories tonight? Yeah, thank you. And I will see you on Thursday for the game. You have... I'll keep the fire going. You have a good sleep.